Welcome to Sermon Updates Midweek, an opportunity for me to share a little more about my message from this past Sunday. This is March 24th. The sermon series we find ourselves in right now is The Greatest Love. It's our sermon series leading up to Easter on April 4th. We've primarily looked at the greatest love from the perspective of God's love for us and how that is demonstrated so powerfully in the death of Jesus on the cross. This past week, we talked about sacrifice. The Old Testament is full of commands to offer sacrifices and examples of times in which sacrifices were offered. Exodus 12, right in the middle of the plagues that God brought upon the Egyptians when the Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites leave, we find ourselves in Exodus 12 at the story about the Passover and how God commanded that a lamb or a goat needed to be slaughtered perfect, had to be offered up for the safety of the firstborn of the household. The blood of that sheep or that goat would be placed upon the door frame at the top and on the sides. And when the Passover angel, the death angel, would come by, it would pass over. And as you study the commands of God to the Israelites in the Old Testament, you find that it is rich with this concept of sacrifice and offering. There are several principles that are important as they're laid down by God in the Old Testament, and that's that the penalty or the price for one's sin wound up being a life for a life. In other words, this poor little lamb, goat, pigeon had to be offered in the place of the individual. Now, pigeons weren't offered at Passover. This is other offerings of the temple. And as such, the hope of the person was that the sacrifice would be enough to take care of their own personal indiscretion, sin. And that principle of a life for a life winds up being something that we see carried out in the death of Jesus on the cross. A reminder that a price had to be paid, a real price, a real offering had to be made. And the price was to be the best you have. It wasn't just something lying around. It wasn't just the worst. Like the first fruits, when fields would be harvested at harvest time, the first yield had to be given back to God, not the last, not at the end, but the first. A principle that we need to remember today, that God gave the best for us. We start contemplating why God would ever have to have his son die. Well, God set out the principle very early that the best had to be offered as a sacrifice. And the payment would be an offering. If you look at the lamb or the goat that would be slaughtered for Passover, they had to be totally eaten. And if they weren't totally eaten, they had to be consumed by fire. In other words, this offering couldn't be a partial offering. You couldn't just give some of it. You had to give the whole thing. You know, when we look at Jesus' sacrifice, he gave himself, excuse me, fully and totally. He offered himself on that cross and he died. I cannot imagine what his followers thought as Jesus hung on the cross. We know there were a few of them standing there that day around the area. We know John was there. We know that Peter had been watching from a distance in the courtyards, and I don't know how many of them actually witnessed Jesus on the cross. We're only told by John, but I wonder what they thought as they knew that Jesus was hanging there dying. Jesus had set this up for them pretty well, I think. Jesus had a perfect attitude about offering himself up. We know he struggled in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he demonstrated time and again that he understood exactly where he was going. Although his followers didn't often understand the language that he used, that his attitude was one of doing his Father's will. And he was the perfect sacrifice offered for you and for me. And he was a perfect example. One of the ideas that has permeated the last few messages, excuse me, that I've shared is that Jesus was leaving us an example of how we should live today. The cross demonstrated his love. It also demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice and his willingness to serve. Mark 10:43 through 45 says, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." That's what Jesus came for. One of my great concerns for the church of today is that narcissism seems to almost be an admirable spiritual quality. In other words, people at times now make it look like it's desirable for us to be narcissistic and selfish. That when we make decisions that are for ourselves, blatantly and clearly, that somehow we've turned that into a good thing, into taking care of oneself and protecting yourself and using different words like that. But Jesus had no interest in protecting himself. Jesus gave all, everything. Fundamentally, I believe that love sacrifices. That's it. Love makes sacrifice. My challenge for all of us this past week has been to sacrifice something, which is an interesting concept in our world. I mean, we don't have altars and we don't have places in which we do ritualistic offerings in our world today. But we do have the opportunity to sacrifice. We do have the opportunity to either give of what we have or to use energy that we have to do something for someone, to make a real sacrifice. Maybe it's giving money away. Maybe it's giving some of your possessions away. Maybe it's letting somebody else get their way. But sacrifice is a fundamental of the Christian value system that God has put in place. Ephesians 5:1 through 2 says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." That's to be our example. Jesus wasn't just the Passover lamb that was slain for us. Jesus is the example for how we are supposed to live. Paul had the right attitude in Galatians 2:20 when he said, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me." Did you hear that, church? Jesus is the example, an example we should follow. What do you need to sacrifice today? I mean, what should you give up today for God? We often contemplate the enormous grace of God that has been given to us and provided to us. And we understand rightly, correctly, that it's only by God's grace that we're saved. We can't do it unto ourselves. But that does not eliminate the opportunity or the ability for us to live out Christ's example and to give up daily. What is God calling you to sacrifice? What does he want you to give up? Totally, completely. The greatest love sacrifices. the greatest love calls us to sacrifice as well. Have a wonderful day. God bless.